The opinions expressed on this program represent the viewpoints of individual authors or contributors and do not necessarily reflect those of Troy University.
Hello and welcome to EconVersations. I'm your host, Dr. Dan Sutter of the Johnson Center for Political Economy at Troy University. Inequality in America has become one of the most contentious issues in politics recently. The perception that some Americans are taking advantage of the rest of us has political currency on both the right and the left, reflected in Occupy Wall Street, the 1%, and Bernie Sanders' presidential campaign, as well as President Trump's call to drain the swamp. If inequality is becoming a growing problem, we should ask what are the possible sources of inequality and how we should think about and respond to each of these different sources of inequality. Joining me today to talk about the sources of inequality in modern America is Dr. G.P. Manish, the BB&T Professor of Economic Freedom with the Johnson Center. Welcome back to the show, G.P.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me again.
And just before we get started into some of the details of this, the discussion we're having today is coming out of a book project that you and Steve Miller are undertaking for the Johnson Center, right?
Yes. It's an edited volume which will contain about 10 or 11 chapters from different authors. And it basically, the book presents classical liberal perspectives on the problem of inequality.
And today we're particularly drawing on a chapter by Professor Randy Holcomb, right?
Yes, it's a chapter by Randy Holcomb, who's a professor at Florida State University. It's one of the chapters in the book, which we're hopefully going to be published soon.
Okay, well, great. So let's get started here. Now, before we start into the question of sources of inequality, one thing that people often sometimes confuse is inequality and poverty, and we start talking about inequality, but we're really talking about poverty. So
yes,
let's be clear that we know what's the difference here between these two issues.
Right. I mean, poverty is really about whether or not you can live at some basic minimum standard or above. That's usually sort of encapsulated in the notion of the poverty line. Some sort of, that you ensure some sort of basic subsistence. And if you get an income or have money that is above the amount needed to buy that basic bundle of goods, then you're considered to be not poor. Inequality is more about the difference between the incomes and therefore the sort of consumption bundles that different individuals in the economy can sort of obtain, right? So it's very possible that you can have growing inequality and falling poverty. And even rapidly declining poverty. But at the same time, you can also have a situation where you have a stagnant inequality and growing poverty, or even increasing inequality and falling poverty, and rising poverty. So all of these combinations are possible.
And to the extent that people tie the two together, they might well be thinking that there's a fixed pie of money out there in the economy. And so if some people have a lot of that, a really big slice of the pie, it must mean that somebody else has a small slice or not enough to feed themselves.
That is possible, but all of these phenomena are related to economic growth. So there is growth happening, so the pie is not fixed. Right. The pie ostensibly is growing. The question is who's getting what proportion of that growing pie, and it's possible in some scenarios that the growth is happening in such a way that the people at the top of the distribution, who are the rich, are getting such a large, incremental share of it that those at the relatively in the lower ranks of the distribution might actually be might see their standards of living stagnating or declining. But that doesn't have to be the case. And you're right, usually people conflate the two because they assume that increasing inequality necessarily means that standards of living of those who are relatively poor are falling.
Right.
But that does not have to be the case.
It's only in that zero-sum view of the world that the rich would, if the rich are getting richer, it must be at the poor's expense.
Yes, and that in most cases that's not true.
And then we also sometimes talk about inequality with regard to income and inequality with regard to wealth. And generally, wealth numbers are going to be more, or the distribution of wealth is going to be a lot more skewed in a society, right?
Yes, because wealth usually looks at the ownership of capital goods, machines, factories, land, tools, including also cars, houses, and things like that. But usually that, especially with respect to the capital goods that are used in production, the ownership of that is far more concentrated. But the income is earned on the basis of not just the ownership of these material goods, but also labor services, right? And so there's a difference between sort of how equal or unequal income is and how equal and unequal wealth is.
And then when we look at wealth over time, since that's in part a question of how much people save and invest each year,
yes.
then people's actions, given that their incomes that they earn are going to be important for the distribution of wealth as well, right? If two families make the same amount of money each year over time, and one of them saves more of that money versus the other spends more every year, then we're going to see a very big. We're going to see a difference in wealth.
Absolutely. So wealth inequality doesn't just fall. The distribution of wealth doesn't just fall from the sky. It's based on your own past actions, right? How thrifty are you? How much do you consistently reinvest? So you can have somebody might be saving and investing, and then all of a sudden they decide to consume a larger proportion of their incomes. All of these things can affect the actual amount of wealth that they possess in the subsequent period of time.
And then I guess one of the big questions that in the inequality debate is whether capitalism leads inevitably to an unequal distribution of income, right? But before we get into that, I guess we probably want to. Economists don't really love the term capitalism. I think we prefer this to think about markets.
Yes.
But what would people normally refer to when they use the term capitalism?
Well, usually the term capitalism refers to a market-based economy, an economy where, to a large extent, or to some extent at least, private property rights in the ownership of the means of production is respected. So it's entrepreneurs in their private capacity who own and possess and decide what to do with these resources that we have. And usually the term is used to distinguish a system from, system of economic organization from that of socialism, where these decisions are centralized, where the ownership of these goods is all centralized and all these production decisions are made by one entity or one group of people and not by private individuals, decentralized. Unfortunately, however, often the term capitalism, while it refers to market-based economies, there are many different kinds of market economies. And so what the term does not really show clearly is the extent to which government interferes with the operation of markets in these market-based economies. And also given the fact that since the fall of the Soviet Union, the whole problem and the debate between capitalism, socialism is much less important in terms of actual economies adopting these systems, at least large economies adopting these systems. The question now is more about looking at different kinds of capitalistic economies, but with differing levels of economic freedom versus government intervention. And so that term does not really capture those differences, and therefore can be unfortunate, because often when you say, capitalism produces inequality, it depends on the actual sort of distribution of those two forces within an economy, right? And so if one wants to be more nuanced and to gain a better understanding of it, one must keep in mind that there are these two forces acting together in what is ostensibly a capitalist economy.
And it is important because you used the term ownership, where you're able to decide what to do with those with a business or factors of production. And that's where government regulation can step in. You might be able to own something, but if the government puts restrictions on what you're able to do with your property, then that's really sort of a case where the political scientists would say, well, that's capitalism, but then it's not really a true market.
It's a hampered market, or it's a market that is, which is beset with regulations and interventions. So you're right. Even in these capitalist economies, the extent of the reach of government interference into the decision making of private entrepreneurs can be different, and that's what the term does not adequately capture. In extreme cases, in fact, for example, if you look at the economy of a Nazi Germany or even India after independence, you had an ostensibly private, you had private property and private entrepreneurship, but the regulations were so intense that it was, for all logical purposes, had no private.
Right.
So that's, if one understands that extreme case, one sees that even within economies where you have private autonomy, you can have different degrees of that with respect to what you do with the resources that you possess.
No, we've never had a pure
Yes.
laissez-faire market here in the United States, right?
Yes, but that is true. I don't think you've had that anywhere.
Yeah, or
but
anywhere.
Historically speaking, in England in the 19th centuries and the United States would be the relatively freer economies as compared to, say, the economies of the Soviet Union or India, for example.
Or our economies today.
Economies today, yes.
So if we look at inequality in the United States, and if we see that it's getting worse over time, if we would say that, then it's not going to be immediately clear, given that we have this mixed economy, that we don't have pure markets. It's not going to be immediately clear whether we can attribute that to the market elements in the economy or the government control elements.
And you're absolutely right. That is a key point, that the use of the term capitalism seems to gloss over. It seemed the way that phrase is used, capitalism produces inequality, seems to imply that it's markets necessarily that produce inequality. But as you mentioned, there are two forces, and so one must investigate. It could be the case that it's largely because of market forces, but at least one must investigate before you reach that conclusion. And to a large extent, the book that Steve and I are editing, that's the sort of overarching inspiration and motivation for the book, is to say, look, let's acknowledge the fact that you have these two forces. We argue it's mostly the government side of it that's producing the inequality, but people might disagree. But I think it's important to at least be able to debate this on these grounds.
So then if before we start to get into some of the sources of inequality, there's one source that I guess we could see that might emerge in a pure, even if we did have a pure market economy, and that I guess flows back to the whole question of how it is that economists think that different factors of production or different workers get paid different amounts, right?
Yes. So assuming one for theoretical purposes that you have a pure unhampered economy, you would have inequality of income, but economists would argue that's linked to the marginal productivity or the productivity of different individuals, that those who are more productive, that is, who create greater value for their fellow citizens, would receive a larger amount and therefore share of the pie that's produced in that given period of time as compared to others. So in that way, according to that argument, then even though you do see inequality, right, it's related to how much you contribute to the welfares of others. Now, to take a simple example, you have a very successful entrepreneur who makes, who's extremely profitable in the production process that he or she's undertaking, versus someone who's making losses. Right? Now, the entrepreneur is going to receive the first one's going to receive more income than the other because it reflects the value that he or she's adding. The same with different laborers, selling their labor services. The more productive ones would earn greater income than the less productive ones.
In looking across different different people who work for a living, the amount of education or training or skills that they've developed can vary very significantly, right?
Absolutely, and all of these things will obviously impact the productivity aspect. But of course, these things can change over time.
Right.
And so someone who's less skilled today can gain skills. Similarly, someone who has specialized in the wrong kind of activity or an activity for which the demand declines can find himself or herself with these skills that were generating high income that are now no longer in as much demand as before.
Now, although differences in productivity are an important determinant of the distribution of income, and thus whether we might have an unequal distribution of income or how unequal a distribution of income, those aren't really the ones we want to talk a lot about here today, right?
Well, yes, because one assumes that is linked to the contribution. Now, in any system of division of labor, you're going to have this sort of inequality. Even in a socialist system, different people are going to contribute to a different degree to the overall sort of well-being of everybody else. Now, there, of course, by fiat, everyone would receive the same amount of income, but in any social system, you're going to have people making differing contributions on the margin to other people's welfare.
Now, but we can go beyond this and think about economists over the years have identified a number of different, I think 3 different sources that we want to talk about here today of possibility of inequality that may not be tightly tied into productivity.
Yes.
And so the first actually goes back to an economist from the early 19th century, right?
Yes, I mean, David Ricardo, he made the argument that a lot of the rent that you see landowners making, and he's talking about largely agrarian society in early 19th century England, that the rents received by the landlords don't necessarily reflect productivity in that sense.
And in a sense, if I guess today we could see this maybe in the value of land in Manhattan or San Francisco, Silicon Valley, in other places. If you own that land, you benefit because the value of the land that you own goes up.
Right.
But that's sort of like a product of our prosperity and not necessarily driving the prosperity, right?
Yes, I mean, in certain cases, if certain individuals happen to inherit certain parts of land, or if they happen to own tracts of land where there was no development, and now over their lifetimes there has been development, then what you're saying would be it's a matter of, in a sense, pure luck that you happen to possess those tracts of land. But of course, even most land is possessed by capitalists. It's still part of the resource allocation process, and so one can question how significant a share to inequality that sort of that source is contributing.
And certainly Ricardo was concerned that this could be a source of inequality because as we become more prosperous, especially the places that are where that prosperity is being generated, or places that prosperous people want to live, that those rents could get bid up simply because there's a limited amount of land.
And they happen to own it. But one thing to keep in mind, though, Ricardo is writing in an economy that is still not transitioned from like the sort of, I wouldn't say feudal, England was not feudal definitely in the early 19th century, but where landowners, due to historical reasons, just because they happen to be born into a family, happen to possess most of the valuable tracts of land. That's not necessarily the case in a more dynamic market economy where a lot of the land ownership is linked and tied to your success with respect to other areas of economic activity. So it's, he's writing in a far more sort of what we would call static or less sort of dynamic world.
There are other individuals in our economy that earn some rents.
Yes.
But they represent a little more complicated case of rents as well. And so the case of athletes would be one instance of they own something, meaning their talents.
Yes.
That's in very short supply and that can't be duplicated very easily, right?
Yes, I mean they're born with that talent, right? It's not, we're not all equal. No matter how much I train, I can never play basketball like LeBron James. But at the same time, I mean, LeBron James has had to work extremely hard to get to where he has. And so how exactly do you differentiate, right? Those two those two different sources, if you wish, the work, the human capital sort of development that he's engaged in, and the pure talent aspect to what he earns.
I mean, hundreds of people play high school basketball. Very few of them can play as well as LeBron. But on the other hand, if LeBron never practiced, he wouldn't be in the NBA, despite his enormous talent.
Yeah, and it's one thing to look at a LeBron James once he's a LeBron James. It's another thing to understand that it's purely because of the market economy that someone like a LeBron James, who's born with just talent and with not much in terms of complementary resources, right? That he can then take the talent and then earn these millions. So it's this can, in the market economy, even those who are endowed with,
Right.
just because of birth, with this sort of talent or this, God-given, these skills, for them to benefit from it, they do so because of the market environment. So, LeBron James, born in the 15th century, is not, unfortunately, not going to be able to develop the talent, that he that he would have possessed. Same with, opera singers or classical pianists, or all of these people, all these sort of professions in which there's so much talent as the sort of core foundation for what you earn.
And even the greatest entrepreneurs, the Bill Gates of the world, certainly benefit from the fact that we have this institutional structure of economic freedom that they didn't create themselves.
They're born into it.
They're born into it, but then they also are doing these things that are productive.
Yes, I mean, one assumes that if Bill Gates was, born on a feudal manor in the 13th century, he's, of course, has this amazing ability to forecast and predict, deal with uncertainty, engage in entrepreneurship, but those skills would not have been very, would not have yielded him the kind of income in those days as they would yield him today.
There's another critic of capitalism who argues that there were a lot of rents that were being generated or actually sort of stolen. That's sort of like, that's Karl Marx's story here, right?
Yes, I mean, Marx's story would be sort of an overthrow of the whole productivity framework, right? I mean, for Marx, the whole foundation of his economic system, is the labor theory of value. So all value can only be generated by those who actually engage in the provision, of actually providing labor. And he was not talking about CEOs, who are also effectively providing labor services. He was talking about, the person toiling away, digging a ditch or building a road, or the people working in the factories with the machines, etc. That effectively every other source of income is exploitative in nature. So the person who's earning income because he possesses land, or the capitalist, the entrepreneurs, all these other streams of income are being earned at the expense of the laboring class. And so in that sense, if you put on those theoretical sort of lenses, then you would have to argue that when you see increasing inequality in a market-based economy, that's a result of this exploitation of one class, property-owning class, against those who own or do not own as much sort of material property in terms of land and capital goods and stuff like that.
But we certainly understand that entrepreneurs, bankers, investors, venture capitalists all provide a lot of very important skills to the economy.
Right. I mean, they are, first and foremost, they're the ones who actually decide where the resources should go, because someone has to do that. Someone has to allocate the available capital. And even, even in a sort of socialist economy, it would be the centralized planners would be doing that. But Marx, effectively, for him, when he looked at the market economy, he saw no role for that function. That function, for some, he assumed, I guess, that these things would just automatically be allocated. But that's not how the world works.
Now, then we come to one other source of inequality, which isn't inherently from the market, whether valid in the case of, you think of Ricardo's rent or Marx's view of exploitation, and that's the role of government, right?
Yes. So again, this is another sort of source that can go against the productivity principle. So this would be the case where certain incomes earned by certain individuals, whether it be through provision of labor services or the ownership of different material forms of wealth, are earned because of certain restrictions and interventions that governments have put in place in a market economy, right? So the simplest case would be where the government comes in and stops anybody from coming in and competing with a certain incumbent producer or entrepreneur. Then in those cases, the actual income earned by that entrepreneur, as well as everybody else associated with that firm in that sheltered industry, would be much higher than it would be otherwise.
Right. Yeah, because one of the things is that dynamic market economy without government restrictions, when somebody builds a better mousetrap and starts to make a profit, others see that and will duplicate that mousetrap, and that competes the profits away. Yes,
and it's important to also note that the problems with intervention work in two ways. It's firstly on the production side, but it's also on the consumption side, because it's it's precisely the market forces and the allocation of resources governed by prices as they emerge on markets and as entrepreneurs foresee them. That's what also gives us the consumer goods, right, that we finally enjoy. So when governments intervene in this way, they not only create inequality in the sense that they favor one set of owners or one set of workers at the expense of others in terms of the incomes they earn, but it also affects the actual availability of consumer goods. We're less rich as consumers because the automatic or the sort of the forces of the market are stopped from allocating resources, as you said in the case of the mousetrap, right? So you'd have fewer mousetraps, and so even as consumers, we'd all be affected.
Right. And so, I mean, whether it be elite producer, elite entrepreneurs, or elite financiers, venture capitalists, or once we allow government into the game, political elites.
Yes.
I mean, it seems like we might be in a situation where the elite are going to benefit a lot, and the rest of us are going to benefit less. So if once we get government and politics into this, are we stuck in a situation where the elites are necessarily going to benefit a lot, or what can be done?
Well, I mean, there is definitely a dynamic that can, a perverse dynamic that can, start working in a market economy, where sort of once you accept, especially if once sort of people believe that these sort of interventions are something that is either useful or whether it's something that is just exists and will continue to exist, that you sort of have this interplay between the political elite and the economic elite, right? So this notion of this 1%, right, where it's not just a lot of the 1%, if you investigate, are not just earning their incomes by participating in market activity. There's this sort of revolving door that is often written about in the press, but also amongst various social scientists of people who take their who work in government and then use that their connections within government to help them gain some favorable interventions when they're enter the market and then flip over back into government, et cetera, et cetera. And now that is a bad dynamic. It does exacerbate inequality. But the point is that that's not inherent in a market economy. So the best way forward would be to work towards recognizing that and to work towards minimizing the parts where there is this sort of perverse dynamic of intervention that makes its way in.
And necessarily thinking that we're turning to more government, the socialist solution to the problem of the 1% isn't necessarily going to solve things, because if government's already causing a lot of the inequality, is more government going to lead to more or less inequality?
Yes, and also it's going to affect production. These interventions are going to make us poorer as consumers as well.
Well, I think these are really fascinating questions, and I think that we need to think deeply about some of these sources of inequality, just so that we have a better sense of how to interpret it or think about inequality going forward, right?
Yes, absolutely, I agree with you.
Well, thanks very much for coming on and talking about this, and thanks for joining us. Join us again next time for another EconVersations.